The shovel hit the ground with a sharp thud, breaking the silence of the quiet morning. David stood over his mother's grave, the early sunlight casting long shadows across the cemetery. His hands trembled, not from the chill in the air, but from the storm of emotions raging inside him. He had spent months questioning everything, her sudden death, the rushed funeral, and the way his father had avoided his eyes ever since. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his bones. "I have to know," he muttered to himself, gripping the shovel tighter. His mother, Clara, had been the kindest soul he knew. She didn't just die. She was taken from him. The doctors had called it a heart attack, but David refused to believe it. She was healthy, full of life. And then, in a blink, she was gone. The grave was fresh, the soil still loose. David worked tirelessly, his muscles burning with every scoop. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. He didn't care about the consequences. He didn't care if the whole town called him mad. He needed answers. As the coffin came into view, David's heart pounded in his chest. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the wooden box that held the woman who had raised him, loved him, and protected him. But then he remembered her smile, her laughter, and the way she had always told him to trust his instincts. This was for her. With a deep breath, he pried open the coffin lid. The hinges creaked, echoing in the empty cemetery. And then he saw her. Clara lay there, pale and still, just as he had last seen her at the funeral. But something was different. Her hands were clenched into fists, her nails broken and bloodied. Her lips were parted, as if she had been trying to scream. And then David noticed the faint scratches on the inside of the coffin lid. His blood ran cold. His mother hadn't died of a heart attack. She had been buried alive. David stumbled back, his legs giving way as he collapsed onto the damp grass. His chest heaved and his mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just discovered. His mother, his kind, loving mother, had been buried alive. The scratches on the coffin lid, the bloodied nails, the clenched fists, it all pointed to one horrifying truth. She had been conscious when they buried her. Tears streamed down his face as he crawled back to the coffin, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her cold, lifeless hand. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I didn't know. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." But even in his grief, a fire began to burn inside him. This wasn't just a tragic accident. Someone had done this to her. Someone had made sure she was buried before her time. And David was determined to find out who. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed the police. The operator's calm voice on the other end felt surreal compared to the chaos in his mind. "I need to report a crime," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "My mother, she was buried alive. I'm at the cemetery now. Please, you need to come." As he waited for the police to arrive, David's mind raced. Who could have done this? His father? The thought made his stomach churn. His father, Mark, had been distant since Clara's death. But could he really be capable of something so monstrous? And what about the doctors who had declared her dead? Were they involved, or had they simply been fooled? The sound of sirens in the distance snapped him out of his thoughts. He stood up, wiping his tears and steeling himself for what was to come. The police would ask questions he didn't have answers to yet. But one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. Someone had taken his mother from him, and he wouldn't rest until he found out who. The police arrived swiftly, their flashing lights cutting through the morning calm. Officers surrounded the grave, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief as they took in the scene. David stood nearby, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes fixed on the coffin. He felt numb, as if he were watching everything unfold from a distance. Detective Harris, a tall, stern woman with sharp eyes, approached him. "You're the one who called?" she asked, her tone calm but probing. David nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, my mother, she was buried alive. I found her like this." Detective Harris glanced at the coffin, her expression hardening. She motioned for the forensic team to begin their work, then turned back to David. "This is a serious accusation. Can you tell me why you decided to dig up the grave?" David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. She didn't just die. Something was wrong. The funeral was rushed, and my father, he's been acting strange ever since. I had to know the truth. The detective nodded, jotting down notes. And your father? Where is he now? At home, I think, David replied. He doesn't know I'm here. Detective Harris studied him for a moment, then signaled to one of her officers. Bring the father in for questioning, and get the medical examiner here ASAP. We need to confirm what happened. As the officers dispersed, David felt a surge of anxiety. His father would be furious when he found out what David had done, but he didn't care. Not anymore. Not after what he had discovered. The forensic team carefully examined Clara's body, documenting every detail. The scratches on the coffin lid, the bloodied nails, the faint bruises on her wrists. It all pointed to a struggle. The medical examiner arrived shortly after, confirming what David already knew. Clara had been alive when she was buried. Detective Harris returned to David, her expression grim. This is a homicide investigation now. We'll need to speak to your father and anyone else who was involved in your mother's death. Do you know of anyone who might have wanted to harm her? David hesitated. His father had always been a difficult man, but he had never shown any signs of violence. Still, there was something about the way he had acted after Clara's death, something cold and calculating. And then there was his father's mistress, Evelyn. David had always suspected she was more than just a family friend. Could she have been involved? I don't know, David admitted. But my father, he wasn't exactly grieving when she died. And there's a woman, Evelyn. She's been around a lot lately. I don't trust her. Detective Harris nodded, making a note. We'll look into it. In the meantime, I need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. This is going to be a long process, David. Are you ready for that? David looked back at the coffin, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. I'm ready. I just want the truth. David sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room at the police station, his hands clasped tightly together. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. Detective Harris sat across from him, her sharp eyes studying him as she flipped through her notes. Tell me more about your father, she said, her tone calm but probing. You mentioned he's been acting strange since your mother's death. Can you elaborate? David took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. He's always been distant, but after Mom died, it was like he didn't care. He didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't even seem sad. And then there's Evelyn. She's been around a lot more since Mom passed. I think they're involved. Detective Harris raised an eyebrow. Involved romantically? David nodded, his jaw tightening. Yes, I've seen them together. They're not exactly hiding it. And Mom knew about it too. She told me once that she suspected something was going on, but she never confronted him. She didn't want to cause trouble. The detective scribbled something in her notebook. Do you think your father could have had a motive to harm your mother? David hesitated. The idea of his father being capable of something so monstrous was hard to accept, but the evidence was staring him in the face. I don't know. He's not a violent person, but he's always been controlling, and he stood to gain a lot from her death. She had a life insurance policy, and the house is in her name. If she died, he'd get everything. Detective Harris leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. That's a strong motive. We'll need to look into his financial records and see if there's any evidence of planning. What about Evelyn? Do you think she could have been involved? David shrugged, frustration bubbling up inside him. I don't know. She's always been nice to me, but there's something about her that feels off. She's too perfect, you know? Like she's always putting on an act. Before Detective Harris could respond, there was a knock on the door. An officer stepped in, his face grim. We've brought the father in for questioning. He's in the next room. David's heart sank. He wasn't ready to face his father, not like this. But he knew he didn't have a choice. This was about his mother, and he owed it to her to see this through. Detective Harris stood up, giving David a reassuring nod. Stay here for now. We'll handle the questioning. If we need you, we'll call you in. As she left the room, David leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought about his mother, her kindness, her strength, and the way she had always put others before herself. She didn't deserve this. No one did. In the next room, Detective Harris sat down across from Mark, David's father. He looked calm, almost bored, as he leaned back in his chair. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone dismissive. "We're investigating your wife's death," Detective Harris replied, her voice steady. "Your son has raised some concerns. He believes she may have been buried alive." Mark's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered for a moment, just long enough for Detective Harris to notice. "That's ridiculous," he said, his voice cold. "She died of a heart attack. The doctors confirmed it." Detective Harris leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Then why did your son find evidence that suggests otherwise? Scratches on the coffin lid, bloodied nails, signs of a struggle. These aren't things we can ignore." Mark's jaw tightened, and for the first time a crack appeared in his calm facade. "I don't know what he's talking about. He's been unstable ever since his mother died. He's looking for someone to blame." Detective Harris studied him for a moment, then slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of Clara's life insurance policy, with Mark listed as the sole beneficiary. "Care to explain this?" Mark's eyes narrowed, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, with a sigh, he leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "You think you're clever, don't you? Fine, I'll tell you the truth, but you're not going to like it." Mark's smirk sent a chill down Detective Harris's spine. She leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. "We're listening. Start talking." Mark crossed his arms, his expression smug. "Clara was a burden. Always so perfect, so kind, so selfless." He spat the word like it was an insult. "She was holding me back. I had plans, big plans, and she was in the way." Detective Harris's eyes narrowed. "So you decided to kill her?" Mark laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Kill her? Number, I didn't have to. She did that herself. She had a weak heart, just like her mother. All I had to do was speed things along." David, watching through the one-way mirror in the interrogation room, felt his stomach twist. His father's words were like knives, cutting deeper with every sentence. He wanted to burst into the room, to scream at him, to demand answers. But he stayed silent, his fists clenched at his sides. Detective Harris kept her composure, though her voice grew sharper. "What do you mean, speed things along?" Mark shrugged, as if discussing the weather. "I gave her something to help her sleep. A little too much, maybe. She went into a coma, and the doctors assumed she was dead. It was easy, really. No one suspected a thing." David's breath caught in his throat. His father had drugged his mother, put her in a coma, and then buried her alive. The realization was like a punch to the gut. He felt sick, his vision blurring as tears filled his eyes. Detective Harris, however, remained focused. "And Evelyn? Was she part of this?" Mark's smirk widened. "Evelyn. She's the one who gave me the idea. She's a nurse, you know. She knew exactly what to use and how much to give. We were going to start a new life together, once Clara was out of the picture." David's heart pounded in his chest. Evelyn, the woman he had always thought of as a family friend, had helped his father kill his mother. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. Detective Harris leaned back, her expression unreadable. "You do realize that this is a confession, right? You've just admitted to conspiring to murder your wife." Mark's smirk faltered for the first time. "I didn't murder her. She was already dying. I just helped things along." "That's still murder," Detective Harris said coldly. She stood up, signaling to the officers outside the room. "Mark Thompson, you're under arrest for the murder of Clara Thompson. You have the right to remain silent." As the officers cuffed Mark and led him out of the room, David finally stepped forward. His father's eyes met his, and for a moment there was a flicker of something, regret maybe, or shame. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You're no son of mine," Mark spat as he was led away. David didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, grief, betrayal. But amidst the chaos, there was one clear thought. His mother had been avenged. Detective Harris approached him, her expression softening. "We'll need to bring Evelyn in for questioning too, but this is a strong case, David. Your father won't get away with this." David nodded, though he felt numb. "Thank you," he whispered. "For everything." As he left the police station, the morning sun felt harsh against his skin. The world seemed different now, darker, colder. But there was a small flicker of hope. His mother's death wouldn't be in vain. He would make sure of it. The police moved quickly. Within hours of Mark's confession, they arrived at Evelyn's apartment. She opened the door, her perfectly styled hair and polished demeanor faltering as she saw the officers standing there. Her eyes darted to David, who stood a few steps behind them, his face pale but determined. "Evelyn Carter," Detective Harris said, her tone firm. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent." Evelyn's composure shattered. "What? This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything." David stepped forward, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "You helped him. You gave him the drugs. You knew what he was going to do to my mother." Evelyn's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked genuinely shocked. Then her expression hardened and she sneered. "Your mother was weak. She didn't deserve him. Mark and we were meant to be together. She was in the way." David's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're a monster, both of you." As the officers cuffed Evelyn and led her away, Detective Harris turned to David. "We'll need you to testify in court. This case is strong, but your testimony will make it airtight." David nodded, though the thought of facing his father and Evelyn in court made his stomach churn. "I'll do whatever it takes." The trial was swift and brutal. Mark and Evelyn's confessions, combined with the evidence from Clara's exhumation, left little room for doubt. Both were found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. David sat in the courtroom, his emotions a tangled mess. He felt relief, but it was bittersweet. His mother was gone, and nothing could bring her back. But at least her killers had been brought to justice. After the trial, David returned to the cemetery. He stood before his mother's grave, the headstone now bearing a fresh bouquet of flowers. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the grass. "It's over, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're gone. They can't hurt anyone else." He knelt down, placing a hand on the cold stone. "I miss you. Every day. But I'll make you proud. I promise." As he stood up, a gentle breeze brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of his mother's favorite perfume. For a moment he felt her presence, warm and comforting, as if she were standing right beside him. David smiled through his tears. "I love you, Mom." And for the first time in months he felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be long, but he knew he wasn't alone. His mother's love would always be with him, guiding him, protecting him. As he walked away from the cemetery, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. David took a deep breath, feeling the weight on his shoulders lift just a little. He had faced the darkness and come out stronger on the other side. And he knew no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would be okay.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.